Hey, Willie, thanks again for meeting me today and giving me the chance to talk to you. I got a copy of your book, started reading it. Super fascinating to me because there's so many little bits of history in there that I did not know and was not aware of. I have very general public school knowledge of the events of during that time, but your book goes into much further details of things that were happening and how things were transpiring that I was just not aware of. So thank you very much for sharing your book with me.
Oh, you're welcome. And I wrote it for people who weren't familiar, or that well familiar, and so I did it in a lot of layers. So, there's the micro level, which is what happened to my family, and then sort of a more macro level, what was going on around them while this was happening. And even my own parents were unaware of sort of the macro the sort of macro events that were going on while they were struggling to survive, and you wouldn't know. And so, anyways, I'm glad you're enjoying it.
Yeah. How did you have a very easy to understand, easy to read style in the way you write? How did you develop that style of writing?
I would say that I learned it in my job because I worked in government doing policy work, and I was working on some very complex files, and I needed senior executives to be able to digest stuff very quickly. So I learned to write to explain complex things in a very simple manner without oversimplifying.
Yeah, that's what I loved about the style of writing is that it's very easy to read, it flows very naturally. One of the themes that stuck out to me about the Holocaust, as a child again, learning about it in school through history books, 50 years, 60, 70 years later, we have the benefit of looking back in the rearview mirror and being able to trace the events of what happened during the Holocaust of World War II. It never occurred to me that for your parents and your family members who were living through that, the level of uncertainty during that time frame. I think some parts of the book mentioned that some people thought like, oh, this will just pass. This is just another thing that's just going to pass because during that time, I also learned that there had already been ongoing legislative discrimination against Jewish people. I didn't know that. I thought it was just the Holocaust that kind of just sprouted out of this thing, but I didn't know that there had been actual government legislation preventing Jewish people from attending educational institutions or other things before the Holocaust happened.
And that's actually all part of it. The Holocaust started in 1933 in March when Hitler was elected chancellor. And it was a very systematic, well planned out process where you first isolated Jewish people, and then you began different levels of persecution, um, and it went into and people were humiliated, they were alienated. It was like an entire process until you reached the stage. I believe that was in 1936, where you were stateless. You were stripped of your citizenship, and at that point, you're extremely vulnerable because uh, you have no legal state rights anymore. You're not a citizen anymore, and so what are you? You're an unwelcome alien, even though your family has been German, could be for 2 centuries.
And what was the exact process of that? Would they just go to people's homes and just strip the passports or whatever documentation they were using at the time, or was it just considered null, or what did they do?
You had a passport. People did have passports, but you were, and this is one thing that's not entirely true. you still had your documentation, but you had no legal status anymore as a German. And and it was at that point where at least many Jewish people thought it was time to leave. And it's an interesting the way it worked out because first thing, you needed to buy your way out, literally. And so some Jewish families basically, and wealthy ones, basically had to, there was a point where you had to sell all your assets anyways to an Aryan, a non-Jew. And that might have been in 1937. I can't remember the different years. But if you wanted to leave the country, you couldn't take any assets with you. So you literally had to sell everything at, 1 cent to the dollar to some Germans. So that's kind of going. Other people thought it would just blow over and didn't do anything, just waiting, because in Europe there was a cycle of there were cycles of anti-Semitism, and they thought this was just another regular sample that you just kind of sit it out. And the saddest thing is that some wealthy families bought their way out, and they went to other European countries like France and Belgium and the Netherlands. So Anne Frank's family were from, I'm thinking Cologne, Germany, but I might be wrong. Maybe it was Berlin. It could be Berlin. Maybe I think it was Berlin. And that's what they did. They set up a new, they moved their business to Amsterdam and thought they would be safe from persecution there. And then the war broke out, and that didn't happen. And so people scrambled for where to go, what to do. I had an uncle. It's in the book. I had an uncle, my mother's brother, one of her brothers was in the Romanian army. In 1936, he deserted, hopped on a boat in Bucharest, and went to Palestine, and missed the war there. In fact, I met him in the 70s. That's it. It was a tragic time where people didn't know what to do. And I look at the Jewish community today, and many people are thinking about what happens if it does get worse.
Yeah.
Here
Yeah.
in North America, Europe, and these are real conversations that are going on. I know on October 7th, someone mentioned to me they had their bags packed, ready to take off if they had to. A couple people told me they were asking their non-Jewish neighbors if they could hide them. So that paranoia is the direct result of the trauma experienced by the community during the Holocaust. A lot of people in the Jewish community are worried about where this is all going. This sudden increase in anti-Semitism that has not dissipated despite the fact that there is a ceasefire in the Middle East, which most Jewish people suspected was just an excuse to hate Jews. And now that the war has ended, it just continues.
Yeah, let's go back to your original reasons for wanting to write this book. Where did this idea germinate from, or how did you get the motivation to want to do the historical research on your family and write a book like this?
And it wasn't entirely my idea. I had written 3 fiction books prior to the memoir, and a couple things happened in 2020. One of them was the lockdown as a result of the pandemic. So people like me had lots of time, free time to do more writing. But at the same time, I had a bit of a cancer scare, and it was very, very minor, but cancer is cancer. And it got me thinking about, my legacy and what I wanted to do with myself, because you don't know how long you're going to be around. And my wife was pushing me to write my family story, and I was reluctant to do so. And one of the reasons was I didn't know a lot of it. My parents didn't talk a lot about their experience. Many Holocaust survivors do not, and my father even less so, because he would just kind of break down. if you raise a subject so you don't ask questions. My mother was not very coherent. I'm not quite sure why she struggled so much to tell her story, other than probably related to trauma as well. So when I first sat down to write my parents' story, what I actually knew, it was 1,800 word blog post, of which there are errors in there. And this was just what I knew. And I did speak to my siblings and what they recollected, but their memory was no different than mine, really. And so I kind of thought, gee, I don't know this story very well. Nobody in the family does that. So I thought it was important, at least for the family, that I pulled together and start documenting it. And of course, it kind of led to a book. And as I did more and more research, obviously I became very obsessed about finding out my family's history, and I ended up going back a couple centuries. There were my two families, my father's family and my mother's family, where their roots, where they originated from, and what kind of work they did. It turned out to be very interesting. And I don't know how far you've gotten, but so my dad's family came from a village in Poland where they were butchers, and I don't know how many generations, but quite a few, because I found records that sort of listed occupations, and it generally said butcher. And my mother's family, they made booze, and they came from originally a region called Galicia, which is kind of a nebulous kind of region that encompasses Ukraine and Poland today. And they came from a town in Ukraine that has the family name. And so, because I used to always ask, where did that name come from? Where did that name come from? Because it wasn't Romanian. And it's only since I wrote the book, it's only recently that I finally got all the information, the entire history. So the research never ends.
Yeah. Well, what was the most surprising thing you learned about either your family side or your mother's experience?
That's an easy question to answer, and there were a couple of surprises, because there wasn't a lot of information shared with us. And my father, when I was growing up, would tell us that he lost a wife and a daughter who was 4 years old during the war. And as far as we knew, that was the case. And he suffered a lot of grief and pain. He would come to tears at times, talking about them. My mother, that's her understanding as well. Part of the research that I did is I was very interested in knowing, well, I had no idea. I only knew his first wife's first name. So I wanted to know the full family name and where they were from, just out of interest. I wanted to know when they were married and where my half sister, when she was born. And so I got access to Polish archives from that region and asked for all the records with my father's surname, which was shortened from mine, which was my name is a shortened form of the original family name. And what I got back was birth and marriage registrations and death registrations from everybody in the town with the last name. And I found a date where my father was married and who did the ceremony. Get all that stuff. And I got birth registrations for two daughters. And the family was shocked. Absolutely shocked. To imagine for 60 years, your understanding is you'd lost one half sister, and find out that there were two half sisters, and neither of them ever reached the age of 4. That was the age of his older daughter at the end of the war had she survived. But the older sister, the older daughter, her name was Leah. She perished at the age of 27. And her younger sister, Yenta, was 11 months. And they perished with their mother in Auschwitz in the gas chamber in August of 42.
Yeah, and I was also surprised to read in the book that you also recovered a photograph, right, of
Family? Yeah.
the
Family.
family who had that photograph of those two half sisters.
My dad had that photograph that we had never seen. It was in a shoebox with a bunch of photos. Some I'd seen before, others had not. And when they passed away, my sister, when we were collecting up stuff, my sister took this box, never even looked in it. And so part of my research is that I wanted to pull together all the family photos because they might be helpful for the book. And so she handed me this box and pulling stuff out. And I don't know who this person is. I spent several weeks identifying people. And I found this photo of 6 people, women. In the back it said Handler family. That was our surname. I assume the oldest person was my grandmother. Again, never saw a photo of her. There were 2 younger women in front of her, and then there was a woman with 2 children next to her. And one of them was in her lap, the other was sitting on the grass. I just kind of looked at it and going, who are these people? And I finally found a photo of his wife, which was in the Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial and Museum in Jerusalem. And so I knew it was that, and I'm going, who are the 2 girls? One of them must be my half-sister. It was only after I got the birth registration that I realized that it was the 2 girls. And that photo was taken, you could tell it was taken outdoors. In fact, I found the spot where they took
Oh
that
my
photo.
goodness.
Oh, that was quite a moment. Because in August of 2022, my wife and I went to Poland. We went to the town. We found my grandparents' apartment building, and in the courtyard behind it, I could recognize. And when we walked into this courtyard, I immediately recognized the buildings around because I had stared at that photo for so long, and I knew right away that's where the photo was taken. So it was taken, looked like spring or summer, so it was probably taken weeks before they perished.
Yeah.
My father was no longer around. He had been deported in the spring to a forced labor camp.
Yeah, and he did amazing things just to survive. I remember one part of the book where he was part of a crew that he knew that he was going to be replaced, and he had to basically lie with the corpses until that, I guess, transferal passed.
Until he could sneak out,
Right.
basically.
Right. You mentioned in the book that he experienced a lot of trauma throughout his life and was emotionally unavailable to you. And you call yourself a replacement child. As a replacement child, I have experienced a lifetime of existential anxiety, feeling unseen, unheard, guilt, and ill at ease with life. However, none of this compares to the grief that my father's passed on to me. What did you mean by that last sentence? None of this compares to the grief that my father's passed on to me.
My father never stopped grieving for the family he lost, which when you learn that you've replaced people and he doesn't stop grieving, it's not a great feeling. But again, that grief stored in his body, and like it, is essentially part of trauma that he experienced, a lot of anger and grief, and that gets passed on to descendants. And so, because he had never worked out that grief, but carried it around, it was passed on. So I grieve for people I don't even know.
I grieve for people I don't even know. I think that that helps me understand and sums it up a lot more. Um, you also mentioned that the focus was also always on surviving, not necessarily enjoying life. Um, Pleasure came from their children, grandchildren, because we replaced the family they had lost. It's an enormous burden on children. Were there moments of levity or any sort of family vacations or anything like that where what did your parents enjoy? Like, was there anything that they enjoyed?
There were no family vacations. We didn't, we didn't really do much of anything. I think in the book, sort of stated you could do it in a couple of bullet points what we did as a family. But there was heaviness in the family, in our household. We had because we had an extra family member. It was the Holocaust. All that trauma can produce a lot of humor as well, but it's kind of a dark, sarcastic kind of form of humor, not the kind of levity that you normally might enjoy. And so even that part of it was a little um, was kind of a little distorted and odd. I don't know. It was just, and my parents, they worked a lot, and so like many immigrant families, they worked an awful lot, and leisure time was something foreign to my parents. And so, in fact, when they got older and they were no longer working, they really struggled because they'd never really had downtime in their life. And it was a very difficult. So even more so, they looked towards their children, grandchildren, to visit and fill their time. So it was, and that was kind of, yeah, it was not your, just not a typical family. So, not even a typical immigrant family because, immigrants will do things and start picking up things in the culture that they grow up in, whether it's sports or whatever. And there was none of that. Absolutely none of that. That's why I say they didn't live, they just survived.
Um, Speaking of humor, that was the one part in the book where I actually laughed out loud, and it was where you say the line, "Who names a child Willie Handler unless they're planning a porn career for that kid?" And I understand, being an immigrant myself, I understand how you what your parents were thinking when with the name changes and trying to have you grow up in the most normal way as possible. Why they named you that and why your family's original family name Oxen Handler. It's a longer name. Why it was condensed, but I just wanted to point out that that was a line when I read it. It just made me laugh out loud. So
Yeah, and I was named after my grandfather, my mother's dad, whose name was Wolf. I have the same Hebrew name, the same Yiddish name. I might have been better off being named Wolf, but I guess, my parents were only in the country several months, and I guess my understanding is my mother asked someone what would be an English equivalent to Wolf, and she was told Willie. So my birth certificate actually says Willie Handler.
okay, yeah, I think that was
Not
a name that
William,
was
not, people say it's not William. Nope, it's Willie.
that reminds me of the play. Gosh, I'm forgetting the name now, but there was a famous play from that Death of a
Willie Loman?
Salesman.
That's a
Yes,
salesman.
Willie
Yes.
Loman. Yes, probably a popular name during that era. What is it that you hope people that read this book? What's your hope that they get out of this?
There's a few things, I guess. The one is what hate will do and how far people will go and how it's a flaw in humanity where hate gets to the level where you no longer see another person as another human being. And it's important for people to be aware that these things have happened in the past and we need to avoid. And when you look at how polarized the world is becoming, when you have leaders saying that certain people don't deserve to live, it scares the hell out of me. You're not looking at them as human beings anymore. And so that's an important, very important message for me. And the other is that, it was just, I wanted to keep my family story alive. Alive. I didn't even know it. And so now I do, and other people have an opportunity. I wrote the book not for my community who knows this stuff well, but I knew there would be many, many people who would be picking it up for one reason or another because they're interested in, they've known me or they know my writing or they're interested in hearing the story and so on and so forth. And I wanted them to get as much out of it as they could. And so, there's a major portion that, during a portion of that book took place during the Holocaust and why it happened and how it happened and what was going on in Europe, because why did people do nothing for all those years? And so those are sort of very important things that I wanted people to get a sense of. And so there's even a chapter on the history of anti-Semitism and how it's different than other type of racism. And so, in that book, that small little book, it's not that large, it's packed with a lot of information.
How is anti-Semitism different than other forms of racism?
Most forms of racism are racial based, I don't like black people, I don't like whatever. Anti-Semitism is conspiracy based for 2,000 years. It started 2,000 years ago with Jews killed Christ and has never ended. There's blood libels. I still heard recently somebody come out and accuse Jews of making matzah, which is unleavened bread, from the blood of Christian babies. It's still going around. This world conspiracy where Jews run everything, like less than 1% of the world's population is running the world. If you think about how absurd that must be, all businesses and the media and so on and so forth, and none of it is true, but it creates misinformation about what the Jewish people are about, which is basically just want to be left alone, and creates resentment that leads to hate.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Don't you know all Jewish people are rich?
Yeah,
even though in the city of Toronto, 35% are below the poverty level.
Yeah, yeah. When I do stop and think about it, it odd. Most of the forms of racism I can think of are like skin color based or external
Right.
based.
Very much, skin color, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And other physical features.
correct.
After the war, in the book, I point out how there were pogroms. Also, they were all conspiracy based as well, because those negative ideas and misconceptions about Jewish people, they continued even after the war, and still continue today.
Yes. I don't know how it can still, just my logical mind, I don't know how it could still continue after, especially after what happened during World War II and the Holocaust. To me, it just boggles my mind. I don't understand it. I really don't.
Well, and there's a new form of anti-Semitism now, which is, and I hear this an awful lot, where people are anti-Zionists. So I don't hate Jews, I just hate Israel. But, not Zionist has now just replaced Jew. And to be honest, 90% of Jewish people, Zionism basically is just the belief of a Jewish homeland. And that has existed since the 19th century. That belief and that desire, which would probably not have happened had it not been for the Holocaust. And so if you're anti-Zionist, you don't believe there should be a Jewish state, which probably is anti-Semitic. But people will tell you, no, that's not what Zionism means, and that's not what an anti-Zionist is. But that's what it is. Israelis have been accused of being colonists without really understanding what the makeup of the Israeli population is. 1/3 of the country is were refugees. They weren't colonists. They were refugees. They had nowhere to go. Nowhere to go. 1/3 are called Sephardic Jews, which were Jews that lived in the Middle East, have been in the Middle East for a couple thousand years. They lived in Syria, Iran, Egypt, Lebanon, all these countries. After 1948, you know what happened to all those Jews in those countries? They were thrown out. They don't believe in a Jewish state, but they sent them all to Israel. They were thrown. Now those countries have like no Jews, virtually no Jews left in Arab countries. They were all basically, they were persecuted and forced to leave. And so that's 1/3 of it. The remaining third are Arabs. And
Yeah.
that's what the makeup, there's no colonists.
Yeah, one of the fascinating things about your book that I did not learn in my history classes again was what happened after the war and the liberation. Like I remember clearly in your book it said that there was no celebrations, there was no it, it really painted a picture for me of what life was like after the war ended. Um, it wasn't like all of a sudden there's just rainbows and butterflies everywhere. And that's something that I had not thought about and was not clearly explained in the history books.
No, and it was, there was actually, and it's true, there was actually no moment of relief because from that moment on, you're trying to figure out how do I keep, you're still in survival mode. How do I stay alive? Where am I going to get food? Where am I going to live? I have no place to go. I don't know where my family is. So, one of the main things that people try to do is try and connect with family members. Well, how do you do that? And if you, in 1945, there was no internet. You think about, and there were, like the Red Cross actually was very instrumental in trying to reunite family members. And they would send out stuff all over the place. I have copies of notice because my aunt was looking for my uncle, who they had been separated early in the war, around 1941 or something like that. She survived Auschwitz. He had been in a number of camps, and she discovered that he was in a hospital in Sweden, surviving from the injuries he had sustained in camps. Took her, I believe, about a year and a half to find him.
I have one question for you. You start off your book with your father and his end of life. What made you decide to like start off with at the beginning?
I think, to me, it was sort of at the end of an era for us. Also, the mindset of the family was not what you would typically expect when the patriarch dies, because all of us had difficult relationships with him, and so it just seemed to be the right place to start off, where it sort of how it ended, and then I got into how it all started. And that's really just a forward, so it's quite short. But I think I just didn't want to start the book way long ago, far away town in Poland. It didn't feel right to me. I just thought, and I guess doing it that way sort of set the tone, set the mood for the whole book. And so I just, it was this feeling I had. And my next book, which is pretty much complete, I started in an unusual fashion as well. Sort of my style is to grab people and give them a sense of what they're going to hear the rest of the way.
Yeah, it was difficult for me to understand your father's mindset and decision making.
It was difficult for us too.
Yes, because have you read or are you familiar with Viktor Frankl's work Man's Search for Meaning?
Books right there on my bookshelf.
I love that book.
Very, very good.
Obviously, he had the will to survive and things to live for so many times throughout his life, which is how he made it through the Holocaust. And it's, the only way I could understand it is maybe when your mother passed away, he lost his why. Like, I mean, he just didn't have a
Well,
why anymore.
he no, he actually he he's a bit of a control freak, and there were certain things that he wanted to be in control of. And one of the things that he was pretty sure that he was going to outlive my mother. He was 12 years older, and so that made a lot of sense. But his health was quite good. Hers was not. And I think Nate, at some point, he came to the realization he was not going to, she was not going to outlive him, and that he was going to be alone. And he expected that she would be around to take care of him. And I spoke to a gerontologist not that long ago who and I spoke to her about this, in fact, and she told me that with her work through with Holocaust survivors, that Holocaust survivors do not fear dying. They've seen death they've seen so much death that their fear is being alone. And so at some point my father decided there was no way he was going to be alone. And so he had his own plans and he basically triggered, and that's what happened.
When you put it that way and you explain it to me that way, that makes so much more sense to me. I think one of the tragedies of trauma and the tragedies of living with a family member who does have trauma is that the family member or the person, because of their past experience, they get they can get locked into certain frames of how the world should be or what the world is, and it's hard for them to see the world in any other way or to put their focus on maybe the more positive aspects of life.
When you've had such a catastrophic experience, what is important in life? I'm not quite sure. My father was focused on money and family, but not family in the sense that you and I might be. He did not have the tools to be a parent. That was the case for many survivors. I've spoken to so many descendants, and there were many people who told me they never were hugged by their parents. And there's a good reason for that. That they lost their parents, some of them at a very young age, and were never hugged themselves. And so that doesn't, or I know one case, at 6 years old, young girl was hidden in a convent, given Christian name and a birth certificate. It was forged, and so it was raised without parents from then on. And that's not an isolated case. So you don't. It's hard to develop parenting skills while you're trying to just survive and live
Yeah.
another day. And there's no examples. There's so many things that are atypical of a Holocaust family. Siblings don't get along very often. Why? Well, you've been raised with almost no extended family, so there are no role models for how siblings get along. And even worse, a lot of animosity kind of develops over time because there will be a children react differently to survivor families. Some of them are like walking on eggshells. They're so concerned about creating any more pain for their parents who've had more than their share of pain. that they just try to be the best son or daughter they can. So they're called the good child. And then there are those that they react to this oppressive household by being rebellious. And they're out partying, having drugs, and fighting with their parents. And so what does that do to the good child? Good child begins to start resenting their sibling because they're causing pain to their parents. And so this is a not an uncommon phenomena in these families. And so the next generation, they don't get to see their cousins because their parents don't get along. So here you are, a small family with very few extended relatives, and they get shut out of the rest of the family.
I had never heard it explained that way before, but you now that you explain it, I do see the patterns. I've seen the patterns of that in my own family. Well, Willie, I mean, I definitely appreciate you hopping on the call and talking to me today. I learned a lot just from reading your book. Again, you present it in such an easy to read and understand way. What's the best way for people to reach out to you or to learn more about your book? Uh, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Can you see me?
Okay, sorry, I had some Wi-Fi problems.
No worries.
And so I think the last I heard is I never heard it put that way.
Yeah, I had never heard it put that way about how it affects the children and how the children tend to not get along because they just don't they're trying to grapple with the generational trauma themselves, and because of that there can be disagreements and
Resentment.
resentment among the
I mean,
siblings.
major, where relationships totally break off. And very often it occurs after the parents pass away. So they kind of stick together for the sake of the parents, and then it's gone. Now, we haven't really talked about it, but the new book I'm working on is on intergenerational trauma. And I interviewed over 100 people. So I have a very good sense of what Holocaust families look like, and how people, and what's happened to them over the years, and how it's impacted in each generation. And so that book will be, I think people will be quite surprised in some parts of it. I wouldn't say it's groundbreaking, but I certainly tried to collect as many characteristics as I could. And also, part of it is to help people who can identify with this stuff, because trauma is universal, right? And it's not exclusive within Jewish Holocaust survivors. And so what they see in my book will really resonate with people, no matter what their background is. And, and the latter part of the book, I talk about how to break that cycle of trauma that gets passed on from each generation to the next. So it will probably be of some value to people, I hope.
Yeah, I look forward to when that book comes out. When are you planning on releasing that or publishing it?
My agent is pitching the book to different publishers now, and well, actually not now, because now's a terrible time because of holidays. So she probably is on a hiatus until January.
Okay, awesome. And
But I hope we find someone early in 2026.
well, thank you so much for being on the show and sharing your experiences with me, sharing the history that I had no idea about with me through your again, your easy to read, easy to follow writing style. I really appreciate that. If people want to get in touch with you or get your book, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, the book is available in different formats on Amazon. So the name of the book is Out of the Shadow, and the author's name, hopefully people know now. I am active on a number of social media platforms, Twitter or whatever it's called these days. To me, it's given, it's like an X-rated movie now. And but also I have a website that is not as active as it used to be. It's williehandler.com. It will my interviews, any type of interview I've done are on a media page, and there's information about books there and things like that. But my blog posts have been moved, and my newsletter have been moved to Substack, and where a lot of writers are actively moving to. It's a great platform. So I suggest people look for me on Substack because I post stuff a few times a day. I just posted this morning an article about tattoos, of all things, because in Auschwitz they tattooed numbers on people's left arm. It was the only concentration camp that did this, which I explain in the article why. But the Bible has certain things that, I believe it's in Deuteronomy, where you're not supposed to alter the body in any way at all. It creates a bit of a dilemma. And then there are grandchildren of Holocaust survivors who want to honor their grandparents by getting tattoos related to them, and it causes turmoil within the family. So I've kind of put this all together. So again, it's stuff that people really probably never knew about, and that's kind of like. And I also have a monthly newsletter. People tell me the stuff I post on Substack's really interesting, so hopefully some people will check me out there too.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Willie. I really appreciate your time.